All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our session today. And we are having a roundtable on the question, what is the Ukraine situation teaching us about our data practices? Basically, when we started reflecting on the GeONG topic, we usually do that a year before the actual GeONG is due. We didn't think of that such a situation would actually be coming and that we should make provisions for it. So when February 2022 arrived, we kind of realized very quickly, well, this is for sure a topic we have to bring at the GeONG and have to discuss with organizations at the GeONG. Of course, back then, we were still hoping that maybe it's just only in quotations, going to be a lessons learned, but that the crisis would be of a short duration and we could already kind of draw bigger lessons from it. But unfortunately, the situation, how it has been unfolding, there is no solution, quick solution in sight at all. So I'm very happy that we have 4 speakers today that are joining us on that roundtable to shed a little bit of light on the aspects of data practices, on the aspects of information management, and how that particular crisis has been affecting the practices and the experiences of the organizations present in the room. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the people that we have. I would first start with our remote participant, Jos Behrens. Maybe can we have, there he is. Hello, Jos. So Jos is from OCHA. He's a data responsibility officer at UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. And he contributes to increasing the use and impact of data in the humanitarian sector. And OCHA's data responsibility workstream is focused on developing principles and processes and tools for OCHA's data management. And of course, OCHA is coordinating the humanitarian response when it comes to that. So Jos has been supporting the OCHA Ukraine Office on Data Responsibility already since 2019, but since February 2020 has been increasing his remote support through advice and also the development and the regular revision of the data and information sensitivity classification, and he's going to talk about that in a bit. Then I'd like to introduce Marina Kopseva from Ground Truth Solutions. She's a senior program manager there and leads the Ground Truth work on aid recipients' perceptions tracking in Ukraine, Moldavia, Poland, and Romania. And this work is currently shaped as a mixed methods research and focus on feeding critical perceptions information into the response coordination and management, and for getting a sense on the quality and effectiveness of the response, basically, and in the eyes of the recipients and local actors, and that all over time. So it's quite a work here. Then we have Gita Angelina Reddy from the ICRC. So Gita joined the ICRC early this year on the data management partnership as a data management partnership advisor. And she has spent the majority of her career in the private sector on improving data collection and processes with digital solutions. And before ICRC worked with the Central Emergency Response Fund in OCHA. And Gita was part of the IM sub-working group established in Geneva as part of the immediate Ukraine crisis response, and worked with her colleagues to piece together new data collection mechanisms to improve transparency of response activities. And last but not least, we have Cornelia Scholz from REACH Impact Initiatives. And Cornelia has a background in disaster management and using geospatial analysis to assess high-risk areas and compounding impacts of climate and conflict related hazards on vulnerable people. She's currently actually based in Kiev, and she has just come out of Kiev to join us here. I'm working as a GIS officer for REACH impact initiatives. And she is particularly assessing the impact of the upcoming winter-related hazards like cold waves and such on the affected population in Ukraine. So once more again, thank you very much for joining us here. And we're going to dive right into our questions. And I'd like to start at a more macro level with Jos from OCHA. So Jos, OCHA as a coordination body, having facilitated a large number of global IM coordination meetings really early on to keep members informed, and also published the data sharing and data protection guidance early on. I mean, one that I've I also read and I've seen, and it's updated. It was updated quite frequently as well, and I had not seen it at that pace before. I mean, at least not consciously. I mean, there was like a guidance coming out, and then you actually kind of reflected on it just the same week, and a new guidance came out, for example. So as you were involved in this, can you let us know how this was for you and what it meant to OCHA?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just checking. Can you hear me okay? The sound is quite loud for me.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Great. So hi again, everyone. And as Sandra said, I'm with OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data, based in The Hague. That's also where I'm calling from now. And our mission is to increase the use and impact of data in humanitarian response, part of OCHA's information management branch. Information management is one of OCHA's 5 core functions. For those of you who are not as familiar with our work, the other 4 are coordination, humanitarian financing, policy, and then advocacy. Within information management, we have the Center for Humanitarian Data, and part of our work is focused on data responsibility, or the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in humanitarian response. We base our work across the sector in a document released by the Interagency Standing Committee in February of last year called the IASC Operational Guidance on Data Responsibility. And that document contains a set of key actions to implement in any response to help improve the management of data in a responsible way. That's also where our support to the Ukraine response was based on. So as you mentioned, Sandra, the key response that we provided from February on data responsibility was this data and information sensitivity classification. Now, this is quite a practical and basic document. It sets out 4 different levels of sensitivity, from low or no through medium sensitivity to high, and then there's severe sensitivity. In each of those 4 levels, there are specific data and information types included, as well as advice on how to share that data in a responsible manner. As you mentioned, in the Ukraine response, what we did is we updated this document very regularly, because the response environment was so rapidly evolving. And as you correctly said, we haven't done that in other responses before. So this is really one of the first times that we've had such high-touch support remotely, but very high-touch in the early days of the escalation of the conflict. The need for these rapid updates really came from our key partners and the OCHA office in country. So we heard from our partners that, for example, certain data and information types should be considered more sensitive than they were before. And that includes live mobility data, which is one of the data and information types included in this classification that we hadn't worked with in other responses so much. You may all have seen that at some point Google decided to take down its live traffic mobility data related to Ukraine, because they were concerned about potential use of that data in the conflict. And we provided similar advice in the classification. So this is something that we found out along the way and then included in the classification. And again, because the circumstances were so rapidly evolving, we had to do that every week or so at first, and then went on to a monthly and then bi-monthly revision cycle. What we're trying to do now, and then I'll hand back over to you, Sandra, is that we're establishing a broader protocol. So not just having this very practical classification document, but establishing what we call an information sharing protocol, which not only has this classification, but also provides guidance on how to retain or destroy data, how to set up data incident management. So what happens if something goes wrong, if there's a data leak or a breach, so which provides more instructions than just the classification. I'll leave it at that, but happy to take any questions now or probably in the Q&A part of the session. Thanks.
Thanks, Jos. You already mentioned that the live data was one particular difficult part of the data and where the classification obviously had to go to very severe. Was there any other data or information that was particularly difficult to classify in this response? Maybe something that you didn't expect and that you ended up having to classify?
Thanks for the question, Sandra. And yes, there were definitely several data and information types that were quite hard to classify. I'll highlight the 5W data, which is included in the classification. So this is data focused on response monitoring, basically showing who's doing what, where, and when, and then for whom. That's data reported by the clusters. So for those of you who are not familiar with the cluster system, which I think all of you are, but is basically any humanitarian response in which the cluster system is activated, brings partners together around key topics such as protection or health to facilitate coordination, and OCHA helps to organize that system. The clusters report this 5W data, and what we were not anticipating so much in the Ukraine response, but we have some experience with it, was that there are sensitivities around the reporting of this 5W data. So certain clusters have concerns around sharing where their members of the cluster are offering certain services within the response. And that is particularly sensitive when we're talking about the oblasts or regions in which there is active conflict. So some of the clusters wanted to make sure that they did not expose their partners to harm, which of course is completely valid. And at the same time, this 5W data is very much needed to facilitate coordination in the response. So it was a constant back and forth with our cluster partners to help us determine what to show about who is operating where in Ukraine. So that was one data and information type that I'll highlight. And you can also see this discussion reflected in the sensitivity classification document. There's quite a few caveats and limitations that are included in the document specific to 5W data that show the sort of considerations that went into sharing this information publicly. The ways in which we can reduce the sensitivity of this type of data is, for example, by leaving out partner names or by representing their activities at a higher level of aggregation. So not showing it per settlement, but for example, at the, let's say the oblast level or the rayon level. So those are the ways in which we can reduce the sensitivity of that data. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Jos. Maybe over to the participants here in the room. So how did you as IMOs on the ground or at HQ use the guideline? Were you aware it was there, and was it useful, or did you have to find your own ways of sharing data and scramble for data? Maybe let's start with Cornelia from REACH Impact Initiatives.
So, I'm happy to. So first of all, yes, we were aware that it's there, and for us also the first time having such a classification also so quickly within the context. It has been extremely useful and something that's every time consulted if there is a new assessment or like a new output being worked on. I think, and you just mentioned it, Jos, like what has been sometimes a little confusing was the updating and how often it is updated. So just being sure that the moment we use it, we're actually using the most recent and accurate version, or kind of having that validation if whatever we kind of see online is actually like the latest, kind of the latest version, and not accidentally missing out on maybe an update we didn't expect. So that would be maybe one of the feedbacks, just having that assurance, what is the latest version, or a like set frequency of either newly validated or like newly updated. I think where it became sometimes a little tricky was especially in complex cases. So when it was not just looking into one data set or one application, but really bringing together different types of data sets and analyzing them across and setting them into a new context. And there was, again, really useful to have the classification. Sometimes it was going a little bit out of the boundaries. We were like, oh, maybe between low or moderate, where do we exactly place it? But just having it as a basis of discussion was super useful. Maybe to mention as a last point where we ethically had or have the most issues or concerns around is the question between benefit and risk. So for example, the type of data for contaminated areas is I think it's highly severity classified. So one of the questions is, if we, for example, have information on the place of UXO's contamination or even chemical contamination, and cannot share it, is this something that actually the people in the area should be made available to have? Like an information, if we do not share it because it's highly sensitive, are we actually putting the people at risk by not sharing this information? And when I say people, I mean literally the people present within those areas. So that would be our biggest ethical kind of question around it. Where do we have benefit and risk, and where could not sharing or being overly protective put people at higher risk? Not saying like there's no final answer to it, but this is like one of the big kind of concerns and ongoing discussions we're having every time. Thanks.
Lovely, Cornelia. That's a very big point. Marina, at Ground Truth, you were focusing on assessments in order to make sense of what's going on. How was that actually for you?
Thank you, Sandra. Well, you know, we found ourselves in a slightly reverse situation where we were concerning ourselves with what not to share, but how to share what we've got. We have fairly rigorous and strict data protection regulations and rules that we follow within the Ground Truth solutions, and there's a ton of protocols that we put in place when we work with external providers who we normally use and we are using in Ukraine, for example, to collect data to ensure that data security is really of paramount importance to them and to us. But what we particularly were keen on is to connect with other agencies, stakeholders, humanitarian donors, to make sure that the data that we collect reaches those who might need it, to use it, to ensure the decision making is based on the information that we are tracking. And what we are tracking are the perceptions of community members, aid recipients, people in need in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries, and trying to make sense of where the aid is going, how it's going, what the communities are thinking about it. So ahead of the recent data collection round that we've just completed, that was a quantitative round. We surveyed 2,000 people, 2,023 to be exact. This one was just within Ukraine. We went to on a scoping mission in July to Ukraine, trying to introduce ourselves to different stakeholders to make sure that we make these relations, make these connections ahead of sharing the data later on. And we found quite an interesting, found ourselves in an interesting situation where we realized that there are quite a lot of open doors, quite a lot of interest from different working groups, networks, Red Cross movement, UN organizations, but also at times we found ourselves feeling our way forward in the dark, trying to find the organizations who could potentially benefit from the data that we're collecting, in hopes of actually influencing the response, improving it, making sure that it's better tailored to the needs and the realities of the communities that are affected by the conflict. And at times it took us weeks to really reach out to all the organizations that we felt would be interested in our data. And it often felt that we have to deploy our own personal networks, snowball for contacts, and that made us wonder, if it's such a full-time job for our organization, what do national NGOs in Ukraine feel like when they want to have a seat at the table and get access to the data or share the data that they already have, maybe at the granular level. So it's really interesting. And on the one hand, yes, we find these varying degrees of interest and openness to receiving the data that we have. On the other hand, along the way, as we made these contacts with different organizations, national, international, Red Cross, UN, we've established an advisory group to this project. So basically the representatives of all these different organizations in Ukraine are invited together every couple of weeks to review our tools that we are producing, to look at the data that we are collecting, to make sense of it. And a lot of the time, the participants to that group are asking us to add questions to the surveys that we are running that are not necessarily intended to ask these questions. So the questions that are definitely beyond the scope of these surveys that we run for the general population. And that makes me wonder that while there is still can be some limited interest in data, there is still some hunger or thirst for data. And I'm wondering if that data that we are being asked to collect is available somewhere, but siloed, kind of overly classified, for want of a better word, or is it not yet collected? And then how can we work on collecting it together and using it collectively as well?
Thanks, Marina. Gita, at ICRC, you usually follow your own guidelines when it comes to data sharing and also data aggregation, classification, and so on. So how was the experience for you and your team?
Thanks, Sandra. Hello, everyone. So ICRC have a data protection framework which we follow, which has its own classifications and guidelines. Personal data protection is very well regulated in ICRC. And with so in terms of Ukraine, we've participated in the IM working groups, I think from the beginning of the crisis, and are still working, finding ways with our Red Cross, Red Crescent partners to better share our own responsive activities. For ICRC specifically, I guess the scale of the operation in Ukraine is unprecedented for Europe. And as a large institution, a key challenge is in those initial stages to scale up. You've got different organizational structures, people, areas of responsibility being put in place, going from, I mean, we've been in Ukraine since 2014, and there's a significant shift in what it looks like in 2022, yes. So for us, and when you're doing that scale up, things like data and information management thrown in can often fall away, and so it's for us to keep it as a priority during that process. And so for ICRC, we have our monitoring processes and then our reporting processes, and they often exist in different life cycles. And a crisis like this, which is large scale, high profile, we need those things to collide and to start producing results in a lot quicker way than what the organization might be used to. And so for us in the initial stages, what comes with data sharing is also understanding data stewardship in a crisis mode, as opposed to in everyday mode, which is it requires a different rule book when you're a large institution.
Thanks, Gita. In fact, there were reportedly, I mean, Jos has also mentioned that before, like data leaks and addresses and contacts being shared, which we have also noticed when we had a team working on some of the maps there. So often this happens without wanting to, of course, and there has also been a lot of press coverage for such type of situations. Also, for instance, for the Ukraine Take Shelter, you might have heard about that. It was a a group of young people, students that have developed this, which was just to shelter Ukrainians that go to another country and seek refuge there, but also without having like data protection aspects in mind as well. And so all this hype about this and that all happening, the press coverage and everything that comes to that. So how does this actually affect you and your work? And maybe we'll start with Marina from Ground Truth. You had been conducting quite many assessments on the perception and the trust of the affected people vis-a-vis the responders and organizations assisting in country and also in the neighboring countries. So what did you find when it comes to these kind of questions, trust, et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you, Sandra. You know, we spoke to 2,023 people, as I mentioned, right? We just finished this first round. And I think what we've been dealing with are the consequences of that trust deterioration in the context. Those 2,000 people, they constitute just the 13% of those that we reached out to in hopes of getting their perceptions. So basically, over 80% of people did not want to participate in that phone interview that we wanted to conduct. Yes, some of them were disqualified because of the answers they gave initially, that they weren't people in need or they weren't aid recipients. But that low number of responses, just 13%, did make us wonder whether it was an indication of the reluctancy, lack of interest, and potentially lack of trust among the population to even respond to an anonymous phone survey when it comes to discussing something that is so presumably relevant to general population in Ukraine. Anyway, it wasn't a survey about a preferred, I don't know, toothpaste brand, right? It was something that's really critical to a lot of people in the country, and still we got quite a low response rate. Nevertheless, we did get a few thousand people that we spoke to. Out of them, only 11% were youth, right? So the engagement level from certain population groups is even lower, and that makes me wonder how much certain groups are really represented in this response, how much access to the data about them we have, and how much, because of that, we can assist in shaping or reshaping the response based on the needs that they have. And as we went ahead with our survey, we started to see that probably this lack of trust comes from the lack of information. We normally ask those who are our respondents to tell us what's important for them in a response and how it's reflected in the reality of the current response. And so we asked how important it was for them to be informed about aid activities, how to participate, how to reach out, how to make sense of what's going on, apply for aid, etc. So generally, it was fairly important for the respondents. However, the actual level of what they experienced was way lower. So it was, I think, only 30% said that they felt fairly informed, while the majority weren't feeling informed at all. And it also looked like a lot of the respondents had unmet needs, especially in light of approaching winter. So yeah, their winterization needs weren't particularly met at the time when we spoke with them, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. And I think 74% didn't know how to provide feedback. I know we hear about those hotlines in Ukraine that are on non-stop, that receive thousands of calls a day. But according to our survey, 74% of people don't know how to share feedback with aid agencies, aid actors, whatever you want to call them. And out of those who did know how to share feedback, so, okay, 74% didn't know, that means 26 did. Out of those 26%, less than a third actually reached out to aid agencies to share feedback. And out of those who did share feedback or complaint, we didn't really specify what kind of feedback they did share. Only 40% were satisfied with the response they got, and 15% never got a response. So I know there's a lot of investment that's going into accountability to affected communities, populations. We are still making sense of the data that we have collected. We are running these concurrent, actually consecutive cycles of quantitative data where we speak to a lot of people, and then we make sense of that data in a series of focus group discussions and key informant interviews in a qualitative round. So we are still talking to the communities in different parts of Ukraine right now, despite the escalation of the conflict. The organization that we're working with are currently interviewing communities. So yes, maybe that will shed some light on what these numbers mean, but currently it looks like despite all this investment, there is still not a lot of genuine two-way communication that's happening in this response, and that probably is also not helping build trust for the aid recipients towards the aid providers. And it seems that this response is generally fraught with the lack of trust. It looks like, well, the population don't trust the media, understandably. They have lost trust in certain local or international actors. Local actors don't necessarily trust the international actors. We've all seen that open letter, I think, penned by the Ukrainian networks and NGOs to the international community. But international community don't trust the local NGOs and each other sometimes as well. And all of that seems to lead to I don't know how to call it, data hogging, where we hold on to our data, the silos walls grow up, and that inevitably means that duplication happens, right? Because if I can't access your data, I'm going to collect my own. And in the strict sense of the word, obviously it's not harm in terms of do no harm. Yes, it's not doing direct harm to communities, but it does lead to funds diversion, activities delay, and generally lower quality of response for the communities. So, yeah.
Thanks, Marina. Connie, as REACH was also and is actually involved in assessments, how was your team affected by all this? And also maybe if you have also feedback on the trust aspect, that will be great.
Thanks, Sandra. So for this question, I've been talking to my assessment colleagues who have been in the country already before February and really had those insights into, since escalation in February, but also before, kind of this before and after picture when it comes to trust and specifically those incidences of data leakage. And actually, I was a bit surprised, but in a good way, in those leakages did not directly impact the trust in terms of the assessment that were conducted, so there was no really felt differences between before and after. However, there is this general issue and this general caution which is there. So we've been talking about how is this dealt with, or how can especially be the connection with local actors and with local communities be strengthened again. So to give two examples from the assessments that were conducted, one was on, for example, the bomb shelters and the need of certain bomb shelters and reconstruction, also in terms of winterization. And an approach we're taking there was, instead of sending enumerators and ask for technical details of those shelters and potentially collecting data on locations as well as weaknesses or also capacities of shelters, instead the questionnaire was changed to ask directly for needs. So for example, instead of asking what is the capacity, how many people could go in and what is missing, to simply be how many, for example, chairs do you need within this area? So it was attempted to go away from recording weaknesses or recording sensitive data to really ask and also leave the decision to the local communities and authorities to decide and tell what is it that you need and then react in that way. A second example, when it comes, for example, to IDPs and collective sites, where most assessments are approached through gatekeepers. So really where there is already a trust there, or where there is already a connection there, and then following through this connection. And then one of the big topics, and a question of data collection in non-government controlled areas, which is a highly sensitive topic. Again, I've been talking to my colleagues from the assessment teams, and the way this is approached at the moment is that no people who are physically present within non-government controlled areas are being interviewed in person. Instead, either people who have recently left those areas, which means within 14 days of the interview, are being interviewed, or people who have friends or family present within those areas and have spoken with them in the last 7 days prior to the interview, are going to be interviewed to kind of get through this kind of second step, not directly talking to them, but through that really gaining that, side of what is going on in the areas. And as a last point to mention, when it comes to remote sensing, what is a big topic and a big way of data collection for impact, before February, there was actually remote sensing being done on environmental impacts of conflict in non-government controlled areas, which has been completely stopped since the end of February. At the moment, remote sensing is used for environmental and also damage assessments, which could be structural damages as well as now especially infrastructure damages on a larger scale, but all, or like none of these in non-government controlled areas, but just in the other areas of Ukraine.
Great, thank you, Connie. Gita at ICRC has its specific place and also its specific remit in this crisis when it comes to neutrality and preserving this neutrality also amongst very opinionated social media news, as we all know. So I believe in this crisis it has been particularly challenging for ICRC. Could you tell us why?
Yeah, look, ICRC are the guardians of the Geneva Conventions, and you mentioned the principle of neutrality means we work with all sides to advocate for the needs of the victims of war. And during this international armed conflict, we've continued to communicate this mandate amongst misinformation and disinformation, and I think we can say that all of that has an impact on the humanitarian system, not just one agency or the other. In terms of assessments, I cannot speak to that. What I can speak to is, I guess, our lessons learned more from a data management perspective and kind of understanding and sharing response activities, which has also been challenging for us. Having external situation updates of our activities, but we took a very different approach, putting in GIS-based data collection tools very quickly after in February. And then using very low-tech tools that already existed in the organization and challenging assumptions of how we normally operate and hooking up cross-functional teams. I think, a lot of the things we talked about this morning, finding solutions by bringing people together that don't normally operate together with a specific goal in mind and achieving things that often it might take institutionally a long time to agree on, by showing that you've got a solution that's ready to be used. And so specifically putting in place, like I said, a GIS data collection tool hooked up to some Tableau dashboards, putting in processes for data cleaning, data enhancement, to ensure that information has a view that can be externally shared, so therefore there is agreement in place. And that process is evolving as we mature and feed into programming for the future response. What remains a challenge from that data management perspective is the gap that's left. So if you're putting in new tools that can have better visibility, more frequent visibility, you can't forget about your old tools. And so the next challenge is to really focus on the cost of reporting processes so that we can capture information once for all the different purposes that we need it for. And it's a key priority for us as an institution, and situations like the current response really highlight how much value we can get once we have kind of achieved that goal.
Great, thank you, Gita. We've already looked at how how to access data, establishing trust and assessing the sensitivity of data, and how that was different for your organizations in this crisis. What would be one of the main aspects for you personally or your organization to take away from the Ukraine situation, fully knowing that this situation is still ongoing and unfortunately no end in sight at the moment? So maybe Marina, do you want to go first? You've been focusing on assessing trust and
yeah, sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There was one point that I was saving till the end, and probably will mention it now, that there were quite a few interesting findings in this last survey that we conducted in Ukraine, and the one that was probably the most challenging for us to face was the fact that, well, you know, a little kind of backstory of it, owing to the popular debate about the role of national versus international aid agencies, we decided to ask this question to the communities: who do you trust more? National actors, whoever they are, or international ones? And what really surprised us is that the respondents told us that basically 74% of them, yeah, it's another 74% figure, but yeah, they trust international organizations without being specific who those might be. And 52% trust national. And that really challenged us quite a bit internally. And as I said, we do keep looking into that data and talking with community representatives to make sense of it. But that was quite an interesting finding for us to come across and to see what we can do with this. Can we, looking ahead, how should we use it? How can we make the conversation about localization more genuinely about looking at that gap in trust, and maybe work with national NGOs if they are willing on that? I don't know how image can be improved, what can be done to make sure that the communities feel greater trust towards their own national actors. That was, definitely an interesting thing for us to look at. But generally, going back to the lessons learned, I think the main and the most obvious recommendation, and that was also the recommendation of the respondents that we got, was that more information is needed, more information sharing is needed, with a full understanding of how dangerous information sharing can be if it's not done properly with all the data protection considerations in mind. We still can't afford to not share information with the communities and with other agencies, other actors in the humanitarian landscape in Ukraine. So besides that, for us, I think it's mostly about getting the basics right. So, you know, if we are running a lot of surveys, are we collecting the data that we really need? Are we definitely going to use all the data that we collect? Should we be asking the questions that we are not going to be able to do anything about the answers to these questions? And in general, I know these questions have been discussed in the sector for years, but as we look at the situation in Ukraine and the response, unfortunately, they still keep coming up. Other thoughts to consider for us would be looking at the different groups that we are targeting with surveys, with collecting information from or sharing information back with. There have been quite a few reports already about the growing fatigue, the survey fatigue among the Roma communities in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. So maybe we should step back and ease up on the Roma, but focus on some of the groups that have somehow gone under the radar, like the youth that I mentioned, that are utterly underrepresented in all the humanitarian data, at least the one that we've been able to access or gather ourselves. Another point would be to take a further step back and to look at the tools that we're using to share that data, share the information. This response that we're looking at has probably the highest share of the elderly population in the recent times. So how is the information that we are sharing tailored to their needs and to the modalities in which they are prepared to share information, but also to receive information when we hopefully share it back with them. So that would definitely be something that we would like to see considered more. And taking 2 steps further back is to see how the data that we are collecting or sharing is fitting into the general broader data landscape in the context, and to see if we are duplicating, are we asking the questions somebody else is already asking? Can we be genuinely working together? For example, for this survey, we were contacted by Clear Global, that's Translators Without Borders, as they used to be known before, and were asked to just add 1 question to ask the households about the main language that they speak at home. So it wasn't a very difficult question for us to ask, so we did ask. Turns out 84% speak Ukrainian, and I think 30-something speak Russian, and a good quarter speak both Ukrainian and Russian at the same level, and 6% speak something else at home. So, it was such an easy thing for us to ask, just 1 question among our, 30 that we asked, but it was just 1 survey instead of potentially 2 surveys, and that's a tiny example of collaborating on data collection, and I'm sure there are quite a few more out there, and just would like to encourage that, and to say that what could be 2 surveys is 1 survey, and also this is open source data, so the data that we collect is available. Obviously it's stripped from all personally identifiable information, but otherwise if anyone wants to use GTS data, it's possible to access it. It's subject to a few data use agreement conditions, but generally we really are seeking great engagement with the data that we are collecting to make sure that unnecessary surveys are potentially avoided in the future if we've already asked these questions.
Great, thank you, Marina. Gita, what are the lessons learned for ICRC?
I can speak to the data management lessons learned. I've already mentioned our need to have fit-for-purpose data collection tools. Outside of that, in terms of GIS tools, we've used satellite imagery to analyze checkpoints, road incidents for field trip planning, and present those to decision makers. We've visualized monitoring results, for example, results of post-distribution monitoring, and presented, for example, the outputs of our cash distribution programs, and visualize those to feed into programming. And I think, a continued challenge for us is to again close the gap between the outputs that we're producing and the visuals that explain the results of the data that we have collected, to actually give recommendations that are actionable to those that are making decisions. And I think we're getting much better at it over time, but having the right type of people in place that can do the translation from here's the data outputs and here's what it means for our programming, and here's a set of recommendations or a set of options that continues to be, I guess, from as data people, the bridge we need to cross, and to push ourselves to keep finding the right type of people, putting them in the right place at the right time to make all this data collection as effective as it can be. I mentioned finding the right people. I think that's one of the current issues that we have, that we might have the right people in place, but in Ukraine specifically, keeping those people over a period of time is a challenge for us. Thanks.
Thanks, Gita. And Connie, Reach, having been active in the country already since 2015, I believe, right? So what changes did you perceive, or your colleagues, and what are the ways forward for Reach and impact initiatives?
So on the organizations level, what was really the biggest change was out of the sudden the huge change in geographic scope. So REACH has been active since 2014, but focused on Donetsk and Luhansk. And that allowed, on one hand, on a very geographic, smaller scope, but also the long duration, to have those well built up communications and bonds and trust with local authorities and with communities. So for example, for multi-sectoral needs assessments, they would actually be often conducted going back to the same communities, often even interviewing the same people, which now since February has not been possible to either do on the scope of all of Ukraine as well as to have already those strong bonds. So for a question on moving forward, the goal is to take a little bit of a step back from that huge context, which was focused on so far on the macro level, to try to analyze all of Ukraine and kind of all types of needs, and try again to go a little more into a smaller scope and find those connections and build those really strong bonds with communities and local authorities, and see how those area-based approaches can really support local authorities and work together and really be the supporting part rather than the assessing part or just assessing part. I think for me as a GIS officer and looking into winterization particularly, what is going to be most important is to have good, up-to-date, clear data, especially on population structures. And when I say population, not just the numbers, but what I've seen right now is a big lack also in demographics. Like considering the big movements that have happened, it can be very unclear what's the demographic structure in certain areas. So to give an example, I am right now working on winter conditions and where they're going to have the most impact. So there are, and we know that certain groups which are particularly vulnerable. So that would be, for example, elderly, but especially elderly who decided to not move. So they might be within areas which have had strong impacts, a lot of impacts during the past weeks, past months, and now facing a strong winter coming in and being highly vulnerable to those impacts. However, those groups, we actually don't really know where they are or what the numbers are. So I think with all the data going forward now, it is really important to consider who are the ones we do not see in it, to not be too quick to trust the data as being the whole truth, but really be aware, is there someone we're actually not focusing or who is left out in the way right now we're looking at things. And maybe as a very final note, on more of a personal experience, I'd like to finish this on a kind of best example experience. So something really amazing I've been seeing when it comes to the use of data and how it can really serve the population and impacted people are apps which are alerting people of air raid alarms. I don't know if you've seen them or if you're familiar with those. There's a whole bunch of different ones. Some of those are giving really high-pitched kind of sounds because it's surprisingly easy to sleep through air raid alarms at night. So the work is an alarm clock. There are other apps which really provide immediately a link to information within the area, for example, to Telegram or to other sources, alerting if, for example, explosions have been reported within the area people are present at the moment. And amazingly, what I've been seeing is using literally children up to like lovely elderly ladies in the shelter using those apps, trusting them, using them, sharing the information, and also teaching each other how to use them. So for me, this has been an amazing example on data use and how really amazing good it can do in kind of early warning and alerting, and how people have been using it to keep safe.
Great. Well, thank you, Connie, for that. Right. We actually are opening the room for questions now. These would be questions around the experiences that our participants have been sharing around data and information management. So keeping it at that level as of course there are many questions than one could have on the context as such, but we are keeping them to information management and data sharing aspects, maybe also trust aspects like what our participants have been mentioning. So we'll have 2 people in the room with the mics. Oh, okay, well, it's one person with 2 mics. And also the online audience, please feel free to also put questions into the chat. Maybe state your name, and then if you want that question to go to a particular...
I think it will be across the board. So.
Okay, fine.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Dano. I'm from Palladium Group. I have an interesting, I work in Moldova on a data for impact project, but we also manage some projects related to refugee response, right? For me, it's interesting how you manage, I assume you work mostly with civilian authorities. Do you manage data sharing with military authorities on that perspective? And why I'm asking is because we have a very bizarre example from Moldova. We were working with, it's called Crisis Cell at the national level, the coordination body from the government. And mostly it's people from the military. And when you approach them on refugee crisis, they say, yeah, that's very interesting, but do you know data about who can be mobilized in case a crisis or a difficulty occurs in the future? I was wondering if you had the same experience and how did you manage it? Thank you.
So who feels inspired? It's a tricky question.
I'm happy to come in briefly, Sandra. I don't know if you can still hear me over there.
Yes, please, go ahead, Jos.
Great. So thanks for the question, Daniel. And I'll respond by saying two things. One is part of OCHA's mandate is indeed civil-military coordination, and so we do have a unit working on that. When it comes to requests for specific data, I have not seen any requests from a military in this context. As you are probably aware, military counterparts are also not part of the humanitarian coordination structure as such under the information management working group. So that sort of information sharing with military is really a sort of separate discussion. But over to the other panelists for additional answers.
Thank you, Jos. Gita?
I was just going to say I don't have knowledge enough to be able to answer that one from my CC perspective.
Anyone else wanting to take that one or take a stab at it?
Yeah, I did say that our data is open source, but it's also subject to quite a few conditions. So we thankfully haven't been approached by anyone. I hopefully won't be asking for that sort of data, but I'm fairly sure that our data use agreement stops us from sharing data with military authorities. So yeah, it would be a difficult conversation, but yeah, I'm fairly sure that we wouldn't be sharing that data because it's ultimately something that can put the communities in harm's way, and yeah, it will be a no.
Great, thank you.
Maybe this is also a good moment to remind people of the humanitarian principles, of which, of course, neutrality and impartiality really inform all of the work that we do across the humanitarian space, including in data management. So the humanitarian principles are also really at the core of the document that I mentioned, so the IASC operational guidance on data responsibility, and they really inform all of the humanitarian work, including data management. So that's another key sort of reference to keep in mind there.
Thanks, Jos. Do we have other questions in the room? I saw another hand somewhere up there at the stage. Yeah, there is a...
Thank you. Gilles from CartONG. Maybe more on the data sharing and data exhaustivity. So you talked a bit about the NRBC data, so nuclear, bacteriological, chemical data. We face that it's highly demanded data in the field from coordination, and it was really hard to gather this kind of data or to find this kind of data. And we were thinking, in this situation, is it better to share something which is maybe not complete, not exhaustive, or is it better to keep it because we are not sure how it can be used? And yeah, so I'm asking for everyone, not one person in particular, but yeah.
So who feels inspired to take that one?
Can you just repeat what type of data?
So like kind of hazard-linked data like nuclear risk or bacteriological risk, chemical risk, like sites.
I think, again, it depends. There's not an easy answer to it. there are generally two categories. Like, for example, with Impact, we've been collecting data on strikes on infrastructure, critical infrastructure, some of it from published newspapers. So if it's, for example, this type of data collection where it collects already published knowledge, but it's not actually putting new knowledge out there, it's definitely would be good to share. On the other hand, we've also used, for example, satellite imagery to look into infrastructure damages. On this one, it would be sensitive and be careful who to share it with. So I think it depends on, is it already known? Like, is this already information that is widely known or even public available, but it's a compilation or like bringing it together? Or is this really something that might be new knowledge or might be very new to it? But actually, this leads really well into our same issue I mentioned before with the data classification and sensitivity. If you know, for example, hazardous, I don't know, chemicals or something like that, or UXOs, is this something that should be kept, confidential because it's sensitive, or would it be more important to share it with authorities or with similar? So I think it really depends on the context, but maybe yours has some insights on that as well.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Connie. I think it sounds like it's worth having a follow-up conversation on this specific data asset within the sensitivity classification. As a reminder, the classification is really meant as a reference. It's not binding by any way, and it's also really focused on Ukraine itself, so not the surrounding countries in which the refugee response is taking place. That just as a reminder. I completely agree that for specific cases, there should be an assessment of the benefits and risks associated with sharing this data. So there's no sort of blanket answer that I can give here that says you should basically err on the side of caution or be more proactive with sharing in all cases. It's really a case-by-case assessment. But I'm happy to sort of follow up both with Connie and to go through the way this data is classified in the classification, but then also for any questions related to specific cases in which you're basically deciding whether or not to share this data. We're happy to set up a call. Thanks.
Thank you, Jos. Do we have more questions in the room? Or maybe online? No, online there is no question. Anyone in the room wanting to know more?
Sandra, while people are making up their minds or thinking of the questions to ask, maybe one thought that came to mind in relation to some of Marina's points around data coordination and the fact that we need to be conscious of and aware of each other's data management activities to avoid survey fatigue and to avoid duplication of efforts more generally. I would want to point to the data sharing platform that we offer as the Center for Humanitarian Data. So it's HDX, the Humanitarian Data Exchange. I think many of you in the audience will be familiar with it, but it's become the sort of go-to platform for sharing any humanitarian data related to any crisis in the world, including in the Ukraine context. One way in which we try to make people aware of the existence of data sets is by including them in what we call our data grids. So for each of the countries with a humanitarian response plan in place, we have a data grid that shows 30 key categories of data, whether or not it's available on HDX, and then also whether or not it's up to date. And so that is really meant to help both prevent duplication, but also use as a sort of call for more data collection if data is not available yet. And I know Ground Troop Solutions are one of our really key data contributors. I was just checking, and I think there's not too much data on Ukraine on the platform yet. That might be due to sensitivity or other reasons. It's not just completely publicly available data that's on the platform. So there's also data that is shared on a case-by-case basis, but for which the presence is announced through something we call HDX Connect. So you only show the metadata, and then users can request access, and then the data is shared bilaterally outside of the platform. So that's one way of making sure people are aware of the existence of data without exposing it completely publicly. And I know ground truth solutions have used that HDX feature quite a bit in the past. So that might be one way of also making the availability of your data more widely known. Thanks.
Thanks, Jos. Marina, you want to react?
Just really quickly, yeah, thank you, Jos. Yeah, we've tried it, and we will continue doing that. We are currently working on the report. So yes, we've got preliminary findings, and I'm happy to share them. But yeah, once the report is ready, we're definitely going to look into sharing it. We're also a bit concerned, or kind of conscious probably is the better word, to not contribute to data graveyards. So we obviously want to engage in dialogues about the data that we're sharing. We want it to be actionable, acted upon. And yeah, so I'm curious if there are any, I don't know, follow-up options as to know that people using the data that you share can engage with once they find it interesting or want to add to it or just want to request it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to follow up with this on this with you offline. We do have a limited survey feature that we've used on HDX, and we've started using that with a few of our partners to help them collect feedback from people who have downloaded their data. The probably easier way, as long as it's not a very large number of people that you're trying to reach, is to basically contact them through the platform and to follow up and see how they've used the data. Anyone who has an account, you can reach out to if they've accessed your data. But I'm happy to discuss the follow-up opportunities. Thanks.
Thanks, Jos. I think there was one question in the room now, no?
Yeah. I have a question, I guess, mostly to Marina regarding expectation management when doing the surveys. You're working in war zones, you're working in areas where people fled to from war zones, so in very tense environment, and the people you're working with are surveying in crisis situations. So what has been your experience regarding expectations? Like, how do you present themselves? Are there cases where you feel that the respondents are hoping for you to make a direct impact on their lives, whereas your role may rather be in terms of collecting data rather than implementing? How do you deal with that on an institutional level, but maybe also on a personal level, if that's not too much to ask for? But
yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Generally, it's a part of the script that is part of enumerator training, instructing those who will be in the field collecting data to make it crystal clear to the community members that, first of all, GTS, if they represent us, are not an aid agency per se, so we are not in the position to manage aid, to provide aid, to target aid, but we are in a position to collect the data and share it to those who might be willing to use that data to reshape whatever aid activities that they are implementing. So we're fairly honest from the very beginning with the recipients or people in need, whoever it is that we're talking to. So does it mean that some people don't want to talk to us after we've announced that? Yes, of course it means that. Sometimes people are not interested in that, and obviously their time is also very valuable, so why would they be speaking to somebody and if they see no value in it? So it does happen, but we want to make it extremely clear that we present ourselves in that way, and that also we make sure that the respondents know that whatever is shared in this interview, in this focus group discussion, is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be personally identifiable information. We still get some refusals after that anyway. Some people just don't feel like talking about things when it starts feeling personal. And what we also do, and is that once we've collected the data, because we still get more people willing to talk to us than not willing, we make sure that we go back and share the data back with the community, saying, okay, this is what we've heard from you. Is that correct? Or this seems weird or strange. What did you mean? Does it resonate with you? Would your community agree with these findings, etc.? So generally, yes, I think it's a bit of a frustrating moment for community members to understand that aid is not going to be necessarily forthcoming based on their conversation with us. But at least we stay on the same page in terms of making sure that there is trust. And often when we share the data back, we get some actionable recommendations from community members. Obviously, we are hoping that some of them would be able to take it forward themselves and advocate for themselves, but most of the time we just do it to genuinely close the loop and make sense of the quantitative data that we've collected to get the final okay from community members before we share it back with those who are in a position to actually make decisions and change aid activities, tailor them to communities' needs. I hope it answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you. I believe we have a question online, right?
Yes, a person is asking a question for Ground Trust Solution regarding the low take-up of rate on the recent survey. Does GTS think this is mostly linked to trust or also survey fatigue? The person is asking because most presenters have mentioned surveys. Are there other approaches to collecting this data or other sources that GTS or the other organization utilize or recommend?
An interesting question. We often use telephone surveys, just random digit dialing when we want to speak to large numbers of aid recipients or people in need in different contexts. This is not Ukraine specific. And generally it helps us reach as many recipients as possible to sample them in the most rigorous way to make sure that we get the best, probably most genuine snapshot of aid situation in the country. So yes, generally we do have quite a few refusals, and it can be partly due to the survey fatigue. It can be due to the lack of trust. It can be due to the lack of interest or thinking that, it's not going to change anything anyway, so people don't feel like investing their time in these surveys. Today, in the morning, I actually went and Googled how much do normal telephone surveys, what's the response rate for an average telephone survey for some, I don't know, marketing company or somebody like that. And it's between 5 and 11%. So, and we're speaking about, I don't know, market research, right, and in peacetime. And so generally, yes, we have a slightly higher response rate, but still probably lower than we would have expected. So there must be other ways of collecting data. So this is what we do for quantitative data collection, right? When we just administer those relatively long, and by long I mean 10, 15 minutes surveys to those who are eligible, so aid recipients or people in need. But then we always go back to the communities and speak face to face with different communities, age groups, genders, people from different marginalized groups to, again, verify the findings, make sense of the findings, and to make sure that we are not just overly reliant on the results of quantitative surveys. So we still do focus group discussions and key informant interviews and all the usual tools for data collection we're still using. And yeah, our favorite approach now is mixed methods research, where we do quantitative rounds, but then we definitely back them up with qualitative to make sure that our data is robust.
Thanks. Does anyone else also want to contribute, since it was generally a question about survey and assessments?
So for me, with the assessments, it's not directly my unit, but I've known from my colleagues as well, like was just mentioned, to have also the key informant interviews, where again it comes in to have those good connections with the communities and the local authorities, and having then also the opportunity to come back in different points of time and see if and how things have changed. And I think for us, I mean, then it of course depends strongly on the type of information that is looked for, but also having some of the assessments done with remote sensing, where it's, for example, used for environmental impacts. It could be with some on water availability, for example, or also some of the flood risks due to shelling, which also gives then an indication in certain areas of some of the issues or needs without having to go to the households, as we're talking about the fatigue, and keep asking. So I think having that combination, or like bringing those different versions together, is probably the best, getting the most holistic image.
Thanks. There seems to be more questions in the room.
Yes, thank you. My question is related to what we were talking a bit before, the coordination in terms of data sharing. I think now every data people is agree with the need of more coordination in terms of like avoid duplication and do more data sharing. And I was wondering if in this context, did you witness higher willingness of actors to share their data and coordinate? By example, I know you said that in HGX there is still not a lot of contribution, but by example, the IM working group, is there like, did you witness a lot of organization willing to come, share, exchange, and try to work together around this data work or whatever?
Thank you. Do you want everyone to take the question, or is it going to yours or someone's in specific?
No, I think it's a global question related to your own experience, so whoever is interesting to answer, let's go.
Thank you. Who wants to?
Well, since the question mentioned HGX, I'm happy to start, but then also over to the other panelists, please. So just to clarify, when I mentioned that there was limited sharing on HGX, I was specific to Ground Truth Solutions. I was just checking and seeing whether they had shared anything related to Ukraine. In general, there's a lot of data related to the Ukraine response available on HDX. So I invite your audience to take a look at both the data grid and then the specific data sets that we have available on data.humdata.org, just to do that plug. So there's quite a bit of data available online there. When it comes to sharing in the response, I think other panel members might have more to add. I did not notice during the IMWGs that I joined that there was more or less appetite to share than in some of the other responses that we've supported. One thing that was quite distinct is that there, especially in the early days after the escalation of the crisis, there were a lot of questions about data sensitivity. So really people were asking, is it okay to share this assessment data? Is it okay to share population figures even, which in any other response is some of the baseline and obviously non-sensitive data, but people really were trying to take a step back and think through potential risks associated with data sharing just because the response is so volatile. So definitely a lot of questions on how to share. So that would be the takeaway, and that's also the sort of need in response to which we then developed this data and information sensitivity classification. So over to others on the panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Jos. Marina?
Yeah, I'll just, I didn't want to speak about it, but I'm going to mention it, that of course data sharing is often, it's governed by policies, but it's also often influenced by personalities, right? And we often find a lot of interest in our data, and its uptake is generally quite good. However, we do find ourselves in situations sometimes when we not only share the data, okay, that was before the sharing the data, but when we try to make connections with a certain humanitarian country team or a certain agency who is holding the reins in the context, and they just wouldn't budge. They are gatekeeping and they are not feeling like sharing the data, for example, about the whereabouts of refugees in that particular country, Ukrainian refugees, whom we are going to have much harder time reaching because it's not Ukraine, right? So they are now in a different place, so it's harder to reach them. So we thought that that agency would be able to help us because everyone's going to benefit if we reach them and we hear from them. It didn't quite happen that way. So yes, it does happen. And so far we are looking for ways to circumvent that. And we've reached out to other, probably less influential, but still very prominent agencies in the country who are much more forthcoming in terms of supporting us. But yeah, definitely there are some roadblocks and gatekeepers, and at times there's nothing that can be done about that, unfortunately.
Anyone else would like to contribute? Okay. There's one more question over here in the room. Can we get a mic there?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question because I'm working in a couple of other, working remotely in a couple of other conflictive contexts. And I'm worried if you have ways that or if you're concerned about surveillance during interviews, not so much after you've collected the data, but during interviews, if you're worried about any type of surveillance for people who are answering your interviews, how are the ways that you protect your survey takers? Is there any way that the act of collecting data in a particular context can be tracked and traced and can put people at risk? Just the mere act of answering a phone survey, and how do you deal with those types of concerns?
I think Marina, right?
I don't have much to say, but I know it's a question for me. Generally, we have quite robust protocols for that, but obviously if the phones are tapped, then there's not much we can do about it, unfortunately. We don't, to my knowledge, warn our respondents about that, and maybe we should. Maybe this is my takeaway from this conversation today. What I do know is that we are definitely not tracking any personal data from those respondents. So we do know their whereabouts, but that's based on what they tell us. And we definitely don't collect their names. Age, yes, kind of age group, generally we ask that, but they can always choose not to share data. And for some of the more sensitive demographic questions that we asked during this last round of interviews, there were quite a few questions that people chose not to respond to, and we were obviously absolutely okay with that, and that didn't disqualify them and the other data that they provided from that. But in terms of somebody else who might be aware of their name and their address and their whereabouts, tapping those phones, yes, maybe we need to look further into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions in the room? We could probably take 2 to 3 more. Oh, there's one online I can see. Okay.
The person is asking, have any panelists noticed within their organization the high focus on data protection in this context carrying over the other context? Because some of these data points mentioned could or should be considered sensitive in lots of places, but in general, the sector isn't always the best at managing this. Have you seen any improvements in your broader organization data management as a result of the Ukraine experience? And I guess it's a question for all the panelists.
I think for ICRC, as I mentioned before, the situation has reinforced our data protection framework and policies, and making sure that we have the right processes in place before we share any information and aggregate it to a point where we can make sure that no one can be detected by triangulating other information to be able to corrupt the level of analysis. So yeah, I think we've maintained our data protection levels.
Connie or Gita, Connie or Marina, you wanna?
I don't have anything specific to say about Ukraine, but I just want to say that we have quite we have a separate dedicated data unit who look into all things that could go wrong with our data. And normally we don't go ahead with publishing our reports or even with, paying our consultants unless they've checked the data and they're absolutely happy with that. So in that regard, I don't think the Ukraine crisis has changed anything for us, because I want to believe that our data approaches have always been quite robust.
Thank you, Marina. Oh, okay, Connie, please go ahead.
That's a good point, because the experience I can share is from the GIS unit, and it's the same. There is a procedure to get validation from different points before anything is published. And part of this validation is also to ensure that no data is published that could cause any harm to anyone. So also having those multiple kind of steps and validation is something that makes me personally also feel much better and secure about having someone else look at it as well and look at it from another direction, because especially working with data or the same analysis for weeks, it can sometimes be like, getting heads into it. And having this assurance from someone with a lot of experience, also from other contexts, really looking at it and checking it if this could cause any harm, I find it very reassuring. And it's something that is the procedure, and it's also happening now with the Ukraine analysis. Probably being also now being used to sensitivity classification, it's definitely helping as well, and really looking into the different types of data sets that's going into.
Thanks. I mean, I really... Oh, sorry, no, go ahead, Jos, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can just come in from OCHA's perspective. So it is definitely a context in which there has been a lot of attention to sort of the risks associated with data and information management. I would say both within the humanitarian response, but then also more broadly. So the topic of mis and disinformation already came up. The risks associated with sort of cyber attacks have been, of course, a prominent feature in news media and reporting about the crisis. And so I would say people, at least the sort of humanitarian responders that we've been working with, are more aware of risks associated with their data and information management. That has not so much led to completely new products or changes in policy on our end. It has led to a speeding up of certain actions. So one example that has already been mentioned a number of times is this classification, which we basically pulled out of the ISP, then got endorsed very quickly and then updated on a very short cycle. That's a way of providing support that we hadn't used before, and that is definitely in response to this sort of the high number of questions and the prominence of the topic of data sensitivity in the response. I would say another example is that we have drafted a short tip sheet with basic data and information security tips. So basically, what can a responder do in their own sort of management of ICT equipment and data assets. So those are some of the changes that we've made in the way we support the response. We are also currently working to get a full information sharing protocol adopted, like I mentioned, as well as several other actions for data responsibility in the response. So yeah, more and at a higher tempo, but not necessarily very different things from other responses. Thanks.
Thanks, Jos. I personally think from what I've been, witnessing and experiencing, I do think it did change a bit, especially on the GIS level. You're asking yourself twice now. Of course, if you have been doing assessments before where you were collecting data on households and where you needed to have a robust protocol before anyhow, because there were personal identifiable information and all of that. You had been doing that before Ukraine, but I think with OCHA and the guidance and everything, these questions, even this question, should we do mapathons? No, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe there shouldn't be any OSM initiative right now in the country with mapping out from satellite images. And I think this is a question that I have not seen before to that extent, that you really ask yourself that question and really looking into kind of GIS type products that are not showing households, but maybe not even critical infrastructure, but just generally infrastructure, and just asking yourself, okay, can we really share this or can we not? Or maybe we should consult, or maybe we should see. So I think there has been a shift in thinking of that, especially for information that is not, that doesn't contain normally personal identifiable information, but really kind of classifying this. So that's certainly something we've been seeing. All right, I think we are at the end of our roundtable today. So I think we are closing for now. Thank you very much for your participation to the 4 panelists, Jos online, Gita, Marina, and Connie here, also for your active participation and all the questions that you've had in the room and also from the questions shared online. Thank you very much, and closing the session now, and see you in the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.